The picturesque town of Maplewood was a place where everyone knew one another. Neighbors greeted each other warmly, children played on tree-lined streets, and scandals were almost unheard of. Among its most admired residents were Dr. Julia Morgan and her husband, Tom. Julia, a skilled and compassionate physician, had built a thriving practice. She was the type of doctor who listened intently to her patients, offering not just medical advice, but emotional support as well. Her husband, Tom, was equally beloved. As a high school history teacher, he inspired his students with his passion for storytelling and his belief in the importance of learning from the past. Together, Julia and Tom seemed like the perfect couple. They lived in an elegant home in one of Maplewood's upscale neighborhoods, hosted dinner parties that neighbors raved about, and were often seen walking hand in hand at community events. Their love story was one of destiny. They met in college, Julia, an ambitious medical student, and Tom, a laid-back education major. Despite their differences, they balanced each other. After graduation, they moved to Maplewood, where they built a life full of love, respect, and shared dreams. To the outside world, they were a beacon of success and happiness. But beneath this perfect facade, cracks were beginning to form. The pressures of Julia's demanding career, coupled with the monotony of her seemingly perfect life, would soon lead her down a path of deception and destruction that no one in Maplewood could have imagined. Julia Morgan's days were packed with appointments, diagnoses, and late-night consultations. She had built a reputation as the town's go-to doctor, known for her kindness and expertise. Yet, despite her professional success, Julia felt trapped in a monotonous routine. Her days were filled with the expectations of others, and her personal life, once vibrant and full of love, now felt stagnant. At home, her husband, Tom, was patient and understanding, but he too was consumed by his work as a high school history teacher. Their conversations revolved around mundane matters like grocery lists, bills, and the occasional dinner plan. The spark that had once defined their relationship had dimmed over the years. Julia began to wonder if this was all life had to offer, success at the cost of passion. Mark, one of her patients, entered her life at a time when she was most vulnerable. A confident and charismatic businessman, he had a way of making Julia feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. It started innocently enough. He'd compliment her professionalism during appointments or crack a joke that left her smiling. Over time, their conversations extended beyond medical concerns. He asked about her life, her dreams, and her struggles, and Julia found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't with anyone else. One evening, Mark invited Julia out for a drink, claiming he wanted to discuss a charity project he was involved in. Julia hesitated but ultimately accepted, convincing herself it was a harmless outing. At the bar, the atmosphere was light, almost electric. For the first time in years, Julia felt free, unburdened by her responsibilities. That night, their connection deepened. They laughed, shared personal stories, and exchanged lingering glances. When Mark leaned in and kissed her, Julia was caught off guard but didn't pull away. It was exhilarating, a break from the predictability of her life. What began as a one-time indiscretion quickly evolved into a secret affair. The excitement of sneaking around and the attention Mark lavished on her became addictive. Julia justified her actions, telling herself it was a temporary escape, something that wouldn't harm anyone as long as it remained hidden. But Mark wasn't the only one. Once the door to infidelity was opened, Julia found herself drawn to other patients who showed her similar admiration. Each affair offered a fleeting sense of freedom, a way to escape the pressures of her daily life. She compartmentalized her actions, believing she could maintain the perfect balance between her professional life, her marriage, and her secret liaisons. What Julia didn't realize was that the lies she was weaving were fragile, and it was only a matter of time before her double life would come crashing down. Tom Morgan always believed he and Julia shared a bond that could weather any storm. They were each other's safe harbor, the foundation upon which they had built their lives. Yet, in the months leading up to their unraveling, Tom began to sense something amiss. It was subtle at first: missed dinners, distracted conversations, and a growing sense of distance. Julia, once open and affectionate, seemed withdrawn. She frequently worked late, her phone always at her side, buzzing with messages she would glance at and quickly dismiss. When Tom asked her about it, she would smile and offer vague explanations about patient emergencies or administrative issues at the clinic. But her answers felt rehearsed, devoid of the warmth that once characterized their exchanges. The first major crack appeared during their anniversary dinner. Tom had planned an evening of nostalgia, reserving a table at the restaurant where they'd celebrated their engagement. He even ordered her favorite dessert, hoping to reignite the spark between them. But Julia seemed preoccupied, her attention drifting to her phone even as Tom poured his heart out. "Are you even listening to me?" Tom finally asked, his frustration bubbling over. Julia looked up, startled. "Of course I am. I've been so stressed with work lately." Her excuse sounded hollow. Tom wanted to press her, to demand honesty, but he held back, unwilling to start an argument on what was supposed to be a special night. The following weeks only deepened his unease. Julia's behavior grew more erratic. She became defensive when Tom asked about her day, avoided eye contact during conversations, and even started sleeping in the guest room on the pretext of being too tired. Tom couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something, but he lacked concrete proof. The tipping point came when Tom accidentally discovered a hotel receipt in Julia's car while retrieving groceries. The receipt wasn't for a conference or work event. It was for a boutique hotel just outside town, dated on a day she had claimed to be at the clinic. Tom's heart sank as he realized the implications. That evening, he confronted her. Julia's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face turned pale, and her voice trembled as she denied any wrongdoing. But when Tom presented the receipt, she couldn't maintain the facade. She broke down, confessing to an affair with Mark, one of her patients. The revelation shattered Tom. He couldn't reconcile the woman he loved with the betrayal she had committed. Julia pleaded for forgiveness, insisting it was a momentary lapse in judgment, but Tom couldn't move past the images her confession conjured in his mind. The foundation of their marriage, built on trust and mutual respect, was now irreparably damaged. The day of the tragedy began like any other, a quiet, overcast morning in Maplewood. Tom Morgan sat in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His mind raced with questions that had plagued him for weeks. Where had their marriage gone wrong? Could he forgive Julia, or had her betrayal irreparably destroyed their bond? Julia, meanwhile, was at the clinic, trying to focus on her patients despite the turmoil in her personal life. She had thrown herself into her work as a way to escape the suffocating tension at home. Yet, no matter how busy she kept herself, guilt and regret loomed large. She had hoped that confessing her affair would allow for a fresh start, but instead, it had widened the chasm between her and Tom. That evening, Julia returned home late, drained and emotionally fragile. The house was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the warmth and laughter it once held. She found Tom sitting in the living room, his face shadowed in the dim light of the television. Late again, he said flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. "I told you I had a long day," Julia replied, setting her keys on the counter. Tom turned off the TV and faced her, his eyes hard and unyielding. "We need to talk." Julia sighed, weary of the endless arguments. "Tom, I'm exhausted. Can we please do this another time?" But Tom wasn't willing to wait. The conversation quickly escalated into an argument, each of them airing grievances that had simmered for months. Harsh words flew, laced with pain and bitterness. "You betrayed me, Julia," Tom shouted, his voice breaking. "You didn't just cheat, you destroyed everything we built together." "I know, and I'm sorry," Julia cried, "but I can't take it back. I've been trying to fix this, but you won't let me." The argument reached a fever pitch when Julia turned to leave the room, desperate to escape the suffocating tension. In a moment of rage, Tom grabbed a heavy glass paperweight from the coffee table and hurled it across the room. He hadn't meant to hit her. He hadn't even processed what he was doing until it was too late. The paperweight struck Julia on the temple, and she crumpled to the floor. Time seemed to freeze. The sound of the impact echoed in Tom's ears as he stared at her motionless form, blood pooling around her head. Panic overtook him, and he dropped to his knees, frantically calling her name and trying to stop the bleeding. But Julia didn't respond. Realizing the gravity of what had happened, Tom called 911, his voice shaking as he confessed, "I think I killed my wife." When the paramedics and police arrived, they found Tom sitting beside Julia's lifeless body, his hands covered in blood. He didn't resist as they handcuffed him and led him away, his mind replaying the moment over and over. The consequences of Julia's death rippled through the small, tight-knit community of Maplewood, leaving everyone in its wake forever changed. The once idealized image of Tom and Julia Morgan, who had been seen as a perfect couple, was now shattered. What followed in the aftermath of that tragic night was a painful unraveling of not only a marriage, but also of trust, respect, and the very fabric of the lives they had built. When Tom was arrested that night, the horror of his actions immediately became the talk of the town. The quiet town of Maplewood was no stranger to occasional drama, but nothing like this. A man, who had once been a teacher and a father, was now being charged with murder. The shockwaves of his arrest went beyond the courtroom, as it was impossible to escape the discussions that raged on every street corner, every family gathering, and every coffee shop. The town was divided. Some believed that Tom's actions had been a momentary lapse of judgment, while others felt that his anger had built up over time, making him a man capable of a tragic outburst. During the trial, the prosecution presented the evidence of Tom's escalating emotional turmoil. They painted a picture of a man deeply hurt by his wife's affair, which they argued had driven him to a point where he could no longer control his anger. The emotional scars of Julia's betrayal were presented as a justification for his violent act, but the prosecution was clear: there was no excuse for what Tom had done. They argued that the violence had been deliberate, a result of years of pent-up resentment and betrayal. The defense, on the other hand, tried to humanize Tom. They portrayed him as a man who had been deeply hurt and emotionally overwhelmed, seeking redemption after his mistake. His defense team pointed out that Tom had immediately called 911 after realizing the magnitude of his actions and had shown remorse from the very beginning. His character witnesses included neighbors, colleagues, and old friends who spoke of his previously calm and collected nature. They stressed that Tom had been a good husband and father, that his violent outburst was completely out of character and triggered by an overwhelming emotional crisis. As the weeks passed, the media coverage intensified. Journalists from across the state flocked to the courthouse to report on the trial, and the public followed the case with rapt attention. The media's portrayal of Tom as a heartbroken man who, in a fit of rage, had killed the love of his life, painted him as both a tragic villain and a victim of circumstances. But the people closest to Julia, the ones who had known her for years, couldn't see Tom in the same sympathetic light. For them, Julia's death had been an unforgivable loss, and many held Tom responsible for the final chapter of her life. The trial culminated in a conviction of second-degree murder, a verdict that stunned many but was, in the eyes of the court, a fair and just conclusion. Tom was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. His life, once filled with potential and hope, was now consumed by the consequences of his rash and violent act. The gravity of his actions began to settle in, and he was left to confront a stark reality. He had not only lost his wife, but had also ruined his own life and destroyed his children's future. For Julia's family and friends, the grief of her loss was profound. Her parents, devastated by the tragic death of their only daughter, were left to grapple with the shock of the circumstances. How had it all come to this? How had a simple marital crisis escalated into a fatal confrontation? The trauma of Julia's passing was compounded by the fact that it had been her husband, someone they once trusted, that had been responsible for her death. Julia's siblings struggled with their own feelings of anger and betrayal. Her younger brother, Mark, whom she had been particularly close to, found it impossible to reconcile the brother-in-law he had once admired with the murderer who now stood trial. He testified in court, speaking about the strong bond he had shared with both Julia and Tom, and how that bond had now been broken forever. In contrast, Tom's family, including his parents and 2 brothers, found themselves in a similar turmoil. They, too, had never imagined that Tom was capable of such violence. They were devastated by the fact that their son and brother had killed his wife, but they also struggled with their overwhelming guilt. Had they missed signs of his distress? Could they have intervened to prevent this tragedy from occurring? Questions of this nature haunted them throughout the trial and beyond. While the families of both Tom and Julia tried to navigate their grief and confusion, the community around them felt the ripples of the tragedy as well. Some people in Maplewood rallied behind Tom, seeing him as a victim of circumstance, a man who had lost control in a moment of weakness. Others felt he should never have been forgiven for the sheer brutality of what he had done. Yet, as the case continued to unfold, it became clear that this tragedy had left no winner, only victims, from both families, from their children, and from the community that had watched it all unfold. The tragic story of Tom and Julia Morgan left an indelible mark on their families, their community, and anyone who followed their tale. While the tragedy itself was unspeakably painful, it also became a source of reflection and learning, highlighting the deeper lessons that can be drawn from such a devastating event. Tom and Julia's story, with its emotional highs and painful lows, offered profound insights into human relationships, emotional well-being, and the catastrophic consequences of unaddressed conflict and resentment. Below are some of the key lessons that can be learned from this heartbreaking story. One of the clearest lessons from the tragedy was the destructive power of unchecked emotions. Tom's emotional state had been deteriorating for months, if not years, before the fatal night. His anger, sadness, and jealousy regarding Julia's affair had built up steadily, but instead of expressing his feelings or seeking help, he internalized them. He became a prisoner to his own emotions, unable to process his anger and hurt in healthy ways. As a result, Tom's emotions reached a boiling point that led to an explosive and irreversible action. His anger wasn't just a fleeting response, it was an accumulated burden that had been ignored and suppressed. The tragedy emphasized how dangerous it can be to ignore negative emotions, whether they're stemming from betrayal, grief, or frustration. When these emotions are buried or left unresolved, they fester and can cause untold damage. For Tom, the failure to confront and express his feelings led to a catastrophic consequence: the loss of his wife and the destruction of his life. The broader lesson here is simple. Emotions, both positive and negative, need to be expressed and processed in healthy ways. Suppressing anger, pain, or disappointment can lead to an emotional explosion that has far-reaching and irreversible consequences. Tom's inability to control or communicate his feelings should serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of emotional repression. At the heart of Tom and Julia's story was the breakdown of communication. Though they had been married for many years, their ability to communicate with each other faltered, especially in times of distress. Julia's affair, an obvious betrayal of trust, was a manifestation of their communication failure. Instead of confronting the problems in their marriage head-on, both Tom and Julia allowed their issues to grow unchecked. Julia sought solace outside the marriage, while Tom internalized his feelings and became increasingly distant. If they had been able to communicate openly and honestly about their struggles, their relationship might have been salvageable. Instead, their failure to engage in meaningful conversations about their issues allowed resentment to fester, and when trust was broken, it became an irreparable crack in the foundation of their marriage. The inability to talk about emotions, concerns, and disappointments was a key factor that led to their tragic end. Communication is the bedrock of any relationship, and the lack of it can be deadly. Couples must make a conscious effort to be open with each other, to voice their concerns, fears, and hopes. It's not always easy, and not every conversation will be comfortable, but it's essential for maintaining a healthy relationship. Tom and Julia's tragic end underscores just how vital it is to prioritize communication before it's too late. Infidelity, in many ways, was the catalyst for the tragedy. While affairs are often seen as a betrayal of trust, in Tom and Julia's case, it was the symptom of much deeper issues in their marriage. Julia's affair was a desperate attempt to find the emotional connection that had been lacking between her and Tom for some time. Instead of openly discussing their problems, they each took a different route to cope, Julia through an affair and Tom through emotional repression. Infidelity is an incredibly painful breach of trust, and it takes a long time, if ever, to rebuild that trust. While some couples can overcome infidelity through therapy, open communication, and mutual effort, the scars from such an event are often deep and lasting. Tom's inability to cope with the betrayal by Julia in a constructive way led to him spiraling into rage and depression. His refusal to forgive or work through his hurt led to a tragic and irreversible decision. The lesson from this part of the story is clear. Infidelity is not just an isolated betrayal. It is often indicative of deeper issues within a relationship. It may be a cry for help, a reflection of unmet emotional needs, or a sign that the relationship itself is unhealthy. But regardless of the cause, infidelity requires a tremendous amount of work, self-reflection, and communication from both parties to rebuild. If left unresolved, the emotional damage can snowball into something far worse, as seen in the case of Tom and Julia. Throughout their marriage, both Tom and Julia failed to seek professional help despite their obvious struggles. Tom, in particular, was emotionally isolated and tried to handle his pain alone. Whether due to pride, fear of vulnerability, or a lack of awareness about the resources available to them, neither Tom nor Julia sought the help they desperately needed. Therapy, counseling, or even just talking to a trusted friend or family member could have helped them work through their issues, or at the very least, they might have found a healthier way to cope. Tom's emotional breakdown, his inability to regulate his anger and jealousy, was something that could have been addressed through counseling or therapy. Likewise, Julia's affair could have been a signal that something was deeply wrong in their marriage, and seeking professional help might have allowed them to either resolve their issues or make an informed decision about their future together. The lesson here is that seeking help is not a sign of weakness. In fact, it's an act of strength. There is no shame in acknowledging that you are struggling emotionally or relationally and that you need support. Whether through therapy, marriage counseling, or talking to a trusted friend, getting help can provide crucial tools for managing conflict, understanding one's emotions, and preventing destructive outcomes. Perhaps the most powerful and painful lesson from Tom and Julia's story is the irreversible damage caused by violence. Tom's decision to lash out in a moment of emotional turmoil resulted in the loss of Julia's life, and the repercussions of that moment will echo throughout the lives of everyone involved. His violent act not only robbed him of his wife, but also created a cycle of grief, anger, and regret that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The lesson here is a stark reminder that violence should never, under any circumstance, be a solution to emotional pain. No matter how intense one's feelings may be, resorting to violence is never justified and always leads to devastating consequences. Tom's actions will forever be seen as a tragic example of how a moment of unchecked rage can irrevocably alter the course of one's life and the lives of those around them. Violence, whether physical or emotional, leaves scars that never fully heal. The ripple effects of Tom's act of violence were felt by his children, Julia's family, their community, and, of course, by himself. Violence destroys everything it touches, and it is always an act that cannot be undone. The story of Tom and Julia underscores the importance of learning healthy coping mechanisms and seeking help in times of emotional distress. In the aftermath of the tragedy, many questions surrounded the notion of forgiveness. Could Tom ever forgive Julia for her affair? Could Julia ever forgive Tom for what he did to her? Could their children ever forgive him for taking their mother away from them? Could the community forgive him for the loss he caused? Forgiveness is one of the most difficult yet crucial aspects of healing, whether it's forgiving oneself or others. While Tom's inability to forgive Julia for her infidelity set the stage for the tragedy, it was ultimately his failure to forgive himself that led to his downward spiral. After killing Julia, Tom would have to live with the weight of his actions for the rest of his life, and the question of whether he could ever find peace with himself was one that loomed large. Forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean forgetting or excusing wrongdoings. Rather, it means letting go of the hold that anger, pain, or resentment can have on one's life. Forgiveness is an act of releasing yourself from the power of another person's actions, and it is a crucial step toward healing. Finally, the tragedy underscored the fragility of life. Tom and Julia had once had a future ahead of them, a family, a home, and dreams to share. In a single moment, that future was shattered. Julia's life was taken away far too soon, and Tom's life was irrevocably altered by his actions. In an instant, everything they had worked for and built together was destroyed. This harsh reality serves as a reminder of the importance of living fully in the present, cherishing the moments we have, and working to resolve conflicts before they become insurmountable. Life is unpredictable, and it can change in the blink of an eye. No one can ever know how much time they have, and so it is vital to make every moment count, to love deeply, to forgive quickly, and to handle life's challenges with wisdom and care. Tom and Julia's tragic story became a cautionary tale, not just about the dangers of emotional repression, infidelity, and violence, but about the fragility of relationships and the importance of healthy communication, self-awareness, and emotional regulation. Their story, though marked by deep pain and loss, was also an opportunity for reflection, learning, and growth for anyone who encountered it. Viewers, what do you think went wrong in Tom and Julia's relationship? Was it just one thing, or a series of smaller issues that led to this tragic outcome? How important do you think communication is in preventing such a breakdown? Can someone really lose control to the point where they take another person's life? What could have been done differently to avoid this tragedy? Do you believe that emotional pain and betrayal can drive someone to act in such a way, or is there always a choice? How do you think unresolved emotions, like anger and jealousy, affect a person's mental state? What role do forgiveness and seeking help play in preventing situations like this? Have you ever seen a relationship fall apart because of something similar? What lessons can we learn from Tom and Julia's story?